All right, so we're going to move on to part 3 of social psychology. And in this part, we're going to start by discussing obedience. So, obedience is the performance of a behavior in response to a direct command. And when we talk about obedience, Stanley Milgram immediately comes to mind. So, we've talked about the Milgram experiment when we talked about ethics. And basically, Milgram wondered if a person could be pressured by others into committing an immoral act, some action that violated that person's own conscience, such as hurting a stranger. So after the events of World War II, he became fascinated with the behavior of the Nazis and the SS, and so he decided to create this experiment. Table 11.3 shows the examples of the learners' protests at different voltages. And before he did the experiment, Milgram actually went and asked psychiatrists, college students, and middle class adults to predict how these participants would behave. Well, all three groups predicted that all of Milgram's participants would refuse to obey at some point in the study. None of them thought that any of Milgram's participants would go to that full 450 volts. Well, guess what? They were all wrong. If you look at table 11.4, it shows the full results. So to kind of break down little bits of this, 2/3 of the participants, so 26 out of 40, were fully compliant and went to that full 450 volts. Of those who decided to defy the proctor of the experiment, no one stopped before that 300 volt level. So people, including Milgram, wondered if it was a fluke. So there were replications. Milgram himself decided he would check and see if gender was an issue. So he did it with 40 women, and the results were identical. 8 other studies also showed there was no gender difference in obedience to an authority figure. Back in 2010, there was a French television show called Game of Death that essentially replicated Milgram's study. And people knew that all of their actions would be aired on television, and despite all of that, it still supported Milgram's experiment from back in 1963. So all these people have replicated the study, and they have shown that this happens time and time again. So in doing that, they actually came up with some ideas as to why. What is it that forces someone into obeying an experimenter's orders? And they came up with some probable answers. So first of all, if they believed the study was worthwhile and that the situation or context in which the obedience occurred was worthwhile, then they would continue to do things like that. So if they arrived with the expectation that they were going to obey, they were likely to continue to obey. Because the shocks only escalated gradually, that gradual repetitive escalation could have caused some of them to obey. You also had the experimenter's behavior and reassurances. The experimenter kept saying that, oh no, that person's fine, that person's fine. And in getting those reassurances, it caused them to continue going. You also had the physical separation, because typically the person administering the shocks was in a different room from the other person. And it was also just a button being pushed. They weren't directly doing harm, they were just pushing a button. So there was also the issue of some people figuring out that the person wasn't actually getting the shocks. So that could have played a role as well. But they also looked at some of the conditions that undermine obedience. And for example, people who are aware of Milgram's original study were not likely to obey in these follow-up studies. They also discovered that if they conducted it in an office building instead of at a university, that played a role in making things different. If the teacher and learner were in the same room, they got different results. If the teacher was required to force the learner's hand down onto the shock plate, they were less likely to continue the high voltages. When the experimenter left the lab and gave orders over a telephone, then they were less likely to continue the experiment. They also had the teacher observe 2 other teachers rebel and refuse to continue, and in some instances that led to them not obeying and continuing. When the teachers were free to choose the shock level, 95% of them did not go over 150 volts, and that's the first point at which the learners started to protest. So we've learned a lot of things because of these studies. We actually know that being at odds with the majority or an authority figure can be very uncomfortable for most people. And we've also gotten the insight that each of us does have the capacity to resist group or authority pressure, Because remember, not everyone obeyed. So despite that uncomfortableness, people do have the ability to go against authority and not be obedient. So we're going to talk a little bit about destructive obedience and prejudice. So during World War II, there was blind obedience to authority combined with ethnic prejudice in Germany, and that's what led to the slaughter of millions of Jews. So when the SS were asked why they would murder so many people, their response was simply, "We were just following orders." So if you look at that table 11.5, it will actually show you some strategies that you can use to help resist pressure to conform or obey when it's something destructive, dangerous, or morally questionable. So they don't have an answer yet as to why some people obey orders and others don't, but it's important to be aware that conformity and obedience are not necessarily completely a bad thing in and of themselves. It's necessary for an orderly society, and it's why such behaviors are instilled in all of us when we're children. The critical issue is not whether people conform or obey, because we all do that in our daily lives. The issue is whether the norms we conform to or the orders we obey actually reflect the values that respect the rights and well-being and dignity of other people. So we're going to talk a little bit about altruism and aggression. We're going to start by talking about altruism, and we're going to talk a little bit about Kitty Genovese. You'll remember her from when we talked about ethics. So she was the 28-year-old who was murdered in New York back in 1964. It's estimated that 6 people saw the crime and heard her screams. One person called during the first attack, but no one called until after 3:30 a.m., after she was already dead. So after the New York Times interviewed people, they decided apathy was the reason why no one helped. And all of this actually caused there to be studies in altruism. So altruism, by definition, is helping another person with no expectation of personal reward or benefit. And that actually falls under the broader heading of prosocial behavior, which is any behavior that helps another, whether the underlying motive is self-serving or selfless. So sometimes people help others out of guilt, or maybe it's to gain something, whether it be recognition, a reward, increased self-esteem, maybe you expect the favor to be returned. And neuroscience evidence that prosocial behavior leads to the activation of brain structures associated with rewards could also be a reason why people like to do good things for others. People who engage in prosocial behavior actually tend to be happier than those that don't. So what increases the likelihood that bystanders will help? Kitty Genovese's death actually triggered hundreds of investigations into this. So there were other experiments conducted that you can read about in your chapter, and a few things that they determined could actually lead to people helping. There's a whole list in your book. I'm going to give you a few details. So they determined people have to go through 3 stages before they're even willing to consider helping. They have to know the situation is actually an emergency. They have to interpret the situation as actually requiring help, and they have to decide it's their responsibility to help. So some of the factors that increase the likelihood of helping: personality factors. People who have high levels of empathy are more likely to help. People who feel good and successful, happy, or fortunate are also more likely to help. If people feel guilty about something, they're more likely to be helpful. If we see other people helping, we're more likely to jump in and help as well. If we see what happened is no fault to the person who's the victim, we're more likely to help that person. It'd be like someone losing their wallet. It's not that person's fault, so let's try to help that person out. We also have to be physically capable and know what needs to be done. If we have a relationship with the person, that also increases it. So we're going to talk about what decreases it. If there are multiple bystanders, other people that could help, that can make a difference. People also fail to help online. Dozens of people have watched Facebook live streams of sexual assaults and of suicides, and no one reported it. So when we have the bystander effect, where there's other people watching, people are less likely to help. So we're going to wrap up this section here, and then we'll finish out this chapter in the next PowerPoint.